I saw a photo of my old college roommate last week. He's a retired dentist, financially stable, and in the picture, he was at a vineyard, smiling, holding a glass of Cabernet. He looked like the perfect picture of retirement. Then this morning, I saw him on the news. He was sitting cross-legged on a highway, part of a blockade, his face set, just waiting to be arrested. And the two images just wouldn't connect in my head. I'm technically part of that same generation. At this stage, time is supposed to feel sacred. It's for family, for travel, for finding some peace after decades of work. Instead, I'm watching people I've known my whole life, people you'd never expect, retired teachers, former social workers, veterans chasing chaos like it's oxygen. It doesn't look like courage anymore. To me, it looks like a compulsion. And it made me wonder, what is really driving them? Because it's clearly not just about this one issue. It feels like something else, something older, something from a long time ago that never really went away.
That is a really powerful place to start, because you're right. It pushes us past the sort of surface level news stuff. We're not just looking at, today's politics. We're trying to dig into these deeper drivers, the complex kind of multi-layered reasons that make these older adults, often, like you said, successful people you wouldn't expect get involved in protest, sometimes really high-risk stuff right now.
Yeah, and that's really our mission for this deep dive, isn't it? When you see this surge in older activists, the behavior, it just feels like it's coming from somewhere deeper, something subterranean.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to unpack it all, the sociological pressures, maybe the psychological history, those behavioral threads that stretch back decades. Are they doing it out of moral duty, or is it really about unresolved history coming back?
I think the research points to a collision, really.
Yeah.
A collision of all those things. When you see, the silver hair and those really determined faces on the front lines, you're looking at so much more than just a political stat. You're watching old conflicts demanding some kind of resolution, or maybe repressed feelings finding an outlet. And I think also that really profound human need we all have for a coherent self, a morally consistent identity, especially when the world feels like it's fracturing.
Okay, so let's start with that first layer, the sociological view. When you have a whole generation, people who are supposed to be, enjoying their golden years, suddenly risking arrest, the sources seem to say this does something important for them socially, like a ritual they need.
That's a great way to put it. It's often described as an identity maintenance ritual. And this is so critical because, in many societies, especially Western ones, the identity of an older person, particularly a retiree, it's just culturally devalued, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
They get seen through this ageist lens.
Yeah.
No longer productive, or an economic burden, or even, as one activist put it, just a financial expenditure to the system. And protesting, it pushes back hard against those stereotypes.
So by getting involved, they get back that sense of value, that self-worth maybe, that work or raising kids used to give them.
Precisely. And there's this fantastic example from Spain, the Ayoflautas. Have you heard of them?
I think I've heard a bit. They came out of that big Indignados movement, right? Mostly older people.
Exactly. Sprang from the 2011 Indignados, or 15M movement. And it's almost entirely older adults, retirees.
Yeah.
The name itself is kind of a giveaway. Ayo means grandpa or grandparent in Catalan.
Okay.
And flautas refers to the flutes the younger protesters often played. So they're like the grandpa flutes, the older guard, supporting the younger generation.
That's fascinating. It builds that connection right into the name. So what kind of dignity does being part of this movement actually provide them?
It creates this really strong collective identity, one that actively rejects that stereotype of the, isolated, passive senior citizen just sitting at home.
Right.
The sources actually quote participants talking about it as a process of dignification of older adults. When they announce they're getting involved, maybe at a local meeting or something, they talk about getting applause, getting real praise. That's powerful validation, isn't it? It's external validation that the wider culture often denies them. It flips that ageist view on its head.
And it's not just that they're there, but how they're there. I noticed the sources mention they specifically embrace their age. They don't try to hide it.
That's absolutely key to the whole ritual. They consciously adapt what they do in protests to fit their physical abilities. Maybe they won't be running from the police.
Right, unlikely.
But they will absolutely sit down firmly and block the way. They emphasize that fighting is ageless. And by doing that, they make their participation legitimate as older people. They're not trying to pretend to be younger. They're actively performing their aging selves as still engaged, still vital. And that itself is a political statement against ageism.
Okay, but here's the paradox, right? The sociological data gets tricky here. Because even though they're pushing back against ageist ideas, they apparently don't often frame their activism around, like, old age identity politics. They're not protesting as old people for old people's rights, not in the same way you see with gender or race-based movements.
Yeah, really is the core puzzle. This idea of unpoliticized ageism.
Yeah.
They definitely see the negative beliefs about aging all around them. They perceive it. But for the vast majority of these activists, the main reason they're out there, it's not primarily about fighting ageism as its own political battle.
Really?
Yeah, only a very small number, like one activist named Anton mentioned in the studies, really saw ageism itself as the main political front line. For most, it's something else.
So if it's not about fighting for themselves as older people, what is the main driver then? What pushes them out there?
It seems to be this deep sense of moral persistence.
Yeah.
You're often looking at mission-driven people, individuals shaped by those defining political and social fights of the 60s and 70s. And for them, doing nothing when they see injustice, especially injustice that feels like it threatens younger generations, well, that's just morally unacceptable. They see current problems as a kind of repeat offense of history's mistakes.
A repeat offense.
Yeah. They fundamentally believe that silence makes you complicit, and that deep-seated sense of duty, it just means they do not age out. They can't just switch off that part of themselves.
And that moral drive gets channeled into their group identity. You mentioned they see themselves as grandparents protesting for the children, for younger generations. That's built into the Ioflida's name.
Right. That intergenerational solidarity becomes their public message, their motto almost.
Right.
And this collective identity, the caring elder, defending the future, becomes much more important, much more salient than just being lumped in with older adults generally.
It gives them moral authority.
It gives their protest weight. Legitimacy. They're performing their role as guardians of the future, not just, complaining about their own situation now.
That must also create a weird dynamic inside the group, though, right? They have to sort of distinguish themselves from other older people who aren't protesting.
Oh, absolutely. The internal critique can be quite sharp. You see participants sometimes, almost demonizing peers their own age who don't get involved. Those who prefer, as they put it, ludic activities at the Casals de Jean Grand.
The local community centers for seniors.
Yes. Places focused mostly on recreation, hobbies, that kind of thing. And criticizing those activities is a really crucial dissociation mechanism for the activists.
So by looking down on the retired centers, they're essentially saying, we're not that kind of old person. We're not the stereotype.
Precisely. They actively draw a line between themselves and the image of the typical, maybe passive retiree who's only interested in leisure. Their activism becomes this powerful way to say, we are not that ageist stereotype of the unproductive, self-absorbed senior. The identity of being an active, morally engaged Ioflauta just completely overrides the generic identity of simply being an older person.
Okay, so the sociology explains the why the world pushes them towards action for identity. But let's pivot to the psychological side now, because the sources suggest the how they act is maybe rooted in older pain, that the real behavioral line goes back to recognizing old patterns of trauma, not just disagreeing with current policy.
Yeah, and that really brings us into this idea of the activist imprint. For many people in this age group, their distrust of government, of institutions, it wasn't just theoretical, it was forged through lived betrayal.
Lived betrayal.
Let's think about the big historical moments that just shattered people's faith. The secret bombings coming to light, the draft lotteries deciding life or death based on a number, the assassinations of leaders people believed in.
Right, huge moments.
Those events created this powerful shared understanding, a schema, psychologists would call it, where dissent isn't just an option, it's almost a moral duty, a protective reflex, whenever that pattern of state betrayal seems to pop up again.
And when those same patterns, that feeling of chaos or betrayal, reappear decades later, the psychological force isn't reason, it's, repetition compulsion. Can you unpack that a bit from the trauma psychology angle?
So repetition compulsion, in this kind of context, it's like the mind and body automatically go back to behaviors that worked, or at least felt like they provided some control or agency, during a past moment of intense chaos or betrayal.
Okay.
If that original trauma, that betrayal, was never really processed or resolved, the person feels this compulsion to re-engage with a similar conflict now. It's almost like subconsciously they're hoping to get a different outcome this time, a resolved ending. The body remembers the action that helped them cope before, and it just insists on doing it again.
That makes me think of that story about Arthur, the guy who was a student journalist at Kent State back in 1970. He's 76 now.
Arthur's story is, it's a really stark illustration of this. He didn't actually see the National Guard shoot the students himself, but he heard the shots. He photographed the immediate bloody aftermath. And that left him with this profound, unresolved moral injury. Seeing the state kill its own young people, it just fundamentally broke his trust, his social contract.
And then, decades later, he sees news footage of federal officers using tear gas on unarmed university students. Different protest, different city, but the same kind of image.
It triggered that original wound. It wasn't a rational thing. It was a deep, almost physical, visceral trauma response. His decision then to drive, 4 hours? To join that modern protest that wasn't about analyzing city ordinances or policy debates.
No.
It was a psychological compulsion, a need to finally act on the horror he'd carried unresolved from his youth. The current issue was just the trigger for that older, deeper pain, demanding attention, demanding resolution.
And that's what psychologists formally call moral injury, or MI. It's different from PTSD.
It is. Moral injury, MI. It's defined as this intense psychological distress that comes after what they call potentially morally injurious events, PMIEs. These are events that just fundamentally violate a person's core moral beliefs. And yeah, it's distinct from PTSD. PTSD is primarily about fear, threats to life, or safety. MI is about the distress that comes from doing, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that just shatter your moral compass.
Okay, that makes sense. And this has been studied a lot in military contexts with veterans, right? How does that connect back to these civilian activists?
Very directly. There's a really relevant study involving Israeli veterans. It showed that MI can be a powerful driver of intense political and social activism after service. But what's really fascinating is how it drives activism. The specific kind of activism depends heavily on the story the narrative the veteran creates to make sense of the morally injurious event, specifically who they blame.
So the underlying moral pain is the engine, but the story they tell themselves about it determines where they drive. That seems maybe a bit too simple. Doesn't ideology, actual political beliefs play a big role?
Oh, ideology absolutely shapes the language they use, the political framework they adopt. But the emotional motor that gets them out the door, that compels the action, is very often rooted in that trauma. And the research suggests this blame mechanism is incredibly powerful in channeling that traumatic energy. You see two main narratives emerge quite clearly.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first one?
The first is what the researchers call the humanitarian narrative. In this case, the veterans placed the blame internally. They blame themselves, or their own group, the army, the nation, for acts they see as morally wrong. Things like using excessive force, harming civilians, actions that violated their own sense of justice. And this narrative is soaked in feelings of shame and guilt.
Shame and guilt. And how does that translate into their activism? What do they do?
It drives what you could call amends making. Their activism becomes focused on trying to fix things, to rectify the wrong. So you see things like anti-occupation activism, trying to raise awareness in their own society, setting up dialogue programs with the other side, or even just volunteering to help the population they feel their actions harmed. One veteran in the study, Ronnie, talked about feeling he'd broken something. His activism was about the effort needed to fix and end the occupation. It becomes a kind of compensation, doesn't it? A way to try and balance the scales for their perceived moral failure and maybe restore their own sense of moral standing. Okay, that makes sense. And the second narrative, that channels the energy outwards. Exactly, that's the national security narrative. Here, the veterans push the blame outside. They blame the enemy or the international community, or maybe political critics, for forcing them into morally difficult situations. For instance, blaming an enemy for using human shields, or feeling that restrictive rules of engagement put them in impossible positions. And this external blame, it generates feelings of anger and intense frustration.
So instead of making amends, the anger leads to justification, defending their actions.
Correct. It fuels intense political activism focused on defense and justification. Their actions often involve aggressive pro-Israel advocacy, pushing patriotic education, fiercely pushing back against media criticism. They see this activism as a vital civic duty, defending the military's honor, defending their country's reputation against what they see as unfair attacks or betrayal from critics, both at home and abroad. The original moral injury gets kind of transformed, sublimated into this fierce, protective stance.
Wow. And you can absolutely see how this applies to the civilian activist we started with. That idea you mentioned earlier that being materially comfortable, like your dentist friend, isn't always a buffer. For those who lived through the 60s and 70s, that stability, that privilege might actually make the guilt worse.
It really can. There's often this profound, unspoken shame. A feeling that, I survived, I'm comfortable now, but we failed. We didn't finish the work back then. A sense that the moral failings they fought against decades ago are back, and they haven't honored the sacrifices their generation made.
And that guilt, that unresolved feeling, it turns into what you called moral hypervigilance.
Yes. Protest becomes almost a form of emotional penance or atonement. They become hyper-alert, hypersensitive to any new injustice that feels like an echo of the past. And sometimes, if you ask these older protesters exactly what they're fighting for now, the specific policy details might seem a bit, well, fuzzy, as the sources put it, or generic.
Because the real driver is older?
Because the initial overwhelming impulse to act is older, deeper than the specific issue right in front of them. The current cause is, to some extent, the vessel. The ritual of dissent itself feels like the necessary payment, the penance they need to perform to quiet that lingering historical shame or guilt.
Which leads us straight into this really crucial behavioral point. The failure of conventional deterrence. Because if the drive is that deep, that psychological, then the usual ways authorities try to control protests, the threat of arrest, consequences, they just don't work the same way with this group, do they?
No, the logic completely breaks down. The core idea here is that deterrence fails when fear has been metabolized into identity. For someone who's carried this activist imprint, this moral injury, for decades, well, the worst, in a sense, has already happened.
What do you mean the worst?
The historical betrayal, the loss of faith in institutions, maybe seeing friends harmed or ideals crushed back in the day. That was the foundational shock. So the calculation of risk now, in the present, it's fundamentally different.
So arresting a 70-year-old blocking a highway doesn't scare them off. It actually validates their whole worldview, confirms that the system punishes people who follow their conscience.
It slots right into their lifelong narrative. The arrest, the jail cell, it becomes proof. Confirmation that they are on the side of justice and the state is the coercive force they always suspected it was. There's an incredible quote in the sources from the retired physics professor. She's being warned by a young police officer, don't get arrested, ma'am. She said, what was it? My fear of you was metabolized 50 years ago. Just, wow, the power in that statement.
It's staggering, isn't it? It means that the immediate fear, the uniform, the threat of arrest, now it lost its power long ago. It got absorbed, processed, neutralized by the bigger historical traumas of her youth. The only fear left is for the systemic threat itself, the thing she's protesting against. So the whole mechanism of deterrence just collapses. The supposed cost arrest, maybe reputation damage, gets reframed as validation, as proof of moral integrity. And there's actual data backing this up, isn't there? From studies of protests facing really heavy-handed responses, like in Hong Kong or Chile, the typical assumption might be that police violence would crush morale, make people feel hopeless, like nothing we do matters. But the research found the opposite.
Yeah, that's what's so counterintuitive. Experiencing police violence or repression, it did not lead to lower efficacy or despair. Coercion was basically useless in stopping the unrest. In fact, experiencing repression positively predicted a stronger willingness to take part in future non-normative actions, things like blockades, occupations, more disruptive tactics.
So the system trying to clamp down with force, actually, pours fuel on the fire. How does that work psychologically? What's the mechanism?
Repression seems to boost two key psychological factors for protesters. First, it ramps up the moralization of non-normative tactics. When the state uses violence against them, it confirms in their minds the absolute moral rightness of their cause. It makes them feel justified in using harsher or more disruptive tactics themselves in the future.
Okay, so it feels more righteous. What's the second factor?
Second, it increases the perceived efficacy of non-normative tactics. The thinking goes something like, wow, if the state is willing to come down this hard on us, our actions must really be hitting a nerve. They must be effective. Therefore, we need to keep going, maybe even escalate.
So they read the violence not as a sign they're failing, but as proof they're succeeding, and proof that the system they're fighting is morally bankrupt.
Exactly that. The experience of repression boosts their intention to resist, often in more disruptive ways, by strengthening both their sense of moral necessity and their belief that those disruptive tactics actually work. And for the aging activist who's already metabolized fear, the repression is just confirmation, proof that their decades-long distrust was right all along.
This really amounts to a huge systemic warning sign, doesn't it? When you have a large group of generally successful older citizens repeatedly choosing to risk arrest, it has to signal a deep systemic failure of listening by institutions.
It absolutely points to a loss of institutional legitimacy. The return of this gray revolt, as some call it. It's like the sources use this powerful metaphor. They're human barometers of an unresolved national conscience.
Human barometer.
Yeah, they're not just out there because they're bored or want attention. They're acting because they genuinely believe the formal channels, the democratic structures, have failed.
Yeah.
That those structures are no longer capable or maybe no longer willing to hear their moral concerns. Their sheer persistence, it's crucial data, it's behavioral data, emotional data, historical data, all telling us that some fundamental issues in society just haven't been resolved.
Okay, let's take that final, maybe deepest dive now into the psychoanalytic perspective. This helps us understand that compulsion we talked about right at the start. We've seen the behaviors rooted in trauma, in sociology, but psychoanalysis looks at the fundamental unconscious drive behind repetition itself.
Right. We have to think about the drive, that sort of basic force operating between the body and the mind. The repetition compulsion we see playing out in activism, it's understood as a direct sign of this drive. It insists, it repeats, because that original conflict, that moment of betrayal, that historical wound, hasn't been truly overcome or processed by the conscious mind. The idea essentially is that the repressed one never gives up fighting for complete satisfaction. It keeps pushing.
And this is where you get that really unsettling idea in political movements, the unconscious tendency to reproduce what one intends to fight against. That sounds incredibly bleak, doesn't it? Like any movement, left or right, is doomed to just repeat the power structures it's trying to dismantle.
It is a dark irony, yeah. And it's tied to that Freudian insight that the pleasure principle, the thing that governs a lot of our mental life, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, is actually inherently conservative.
Conservative, how so?
Because its ultimate goal is to maintain a low level of tension. Homeostasis. It wants to return things to a state of quiet, of equilibrium, minimum stimulation.
So even when we consciously want radical change, freedom, whatever, there's this unconscious pullback towards keeping things stable, low tension, predictable.
Exactly. That's the paradox. The sources point out that even, say, libertarian revolutions often kind of sense this deception within their own rhetoric. They demand total freedom, individual rights, but often end up carrying this hidden conservative impulse towards a new kind of order, a new servitude. They might overthrow one master, like a tyrannical government, only to become slaves to another, that internal conservative drive for stability, which can then pop up as new forms of rigidity or dogma within the movement itself.
Can you make that more concrete? How does a movement fighting for freedom end up recreating authority?
Well, think about the history of revolutions. It's sadly full of examples where movements that fought against authoritarianism ended up implementing their own internal purges, creating rigid hierarchies, or enforcing a kind of political correctness that crushes internal dissent. Freud himself noted this about, say, Russian Bolshevism, how it gradually started to look disturbingly like the czarist regime it replaced. This ambiguity, as the sources call it, that you find in both right-wing and left-wing political movements, it suggests they might share this same foundation given by the unconscious. That conservative drive for stability just keeps reasserting itself, no matter what the explicit political label is.
Okay, if the default impulse is always this conservative pull towards inertia, towards repeating the past, how can any political action ever be genuinely progressive or subversive? How do you break that loop of repetition?
The counterforce, in psychoanalytic terms, is desire. Or you could think of it as the drive in its fecund function, its creative capacity. Desire is what's potentially subversive because it pushes us beyond the conservative inertia of the pleasure principle. Desire works on the edge of lack. It's always reaching for something new, something more, rather than just wanting to go back to a state of quiet.
And this brings us back to sublimation. That's the progressive, maybe ethical aspect of the drive.
Sublimation is absolutely key here. It's about changing the target of the drive, diverting that powerful psychic energy away from just direct gratification or that conservative pull towards sameness, and aiming it towards higher goals, things like art, science, or, crucially here, committed social and political action.
Okay.
Sublimation offers a different kind of satisfaction, an ethical satisfaction that goes beyond just giving in to resignation. It's the ethical dimension of desire that can mobilize people to act against inertia, against historical repetition.
So for the aging activists we've been talking about, their protest, driven by this ethical desire, becomes a way of creating meaning out of the historical damage, the trauma. Instead of just being stuck repeating past failures, the action itself becomes a form of mastery. They're seizing control.
Yes, they're turning that passive experience of suffering or witnessing suffering into active engagement. By committing to action that's rooted in this ethical desire, they achieve a kind of possible pleasure, as the psychoanalyst might put it. Pleasure found through meaning, through purpose, through making an impact, rather than just giving in to the drive towards, well, entropy or that conservative inertia that says, it's too late, I'm too old, nothing changes. The ethical act of protest becomes their way of trying, finally, to rewrite that unresolved ending from the past.
Yeah.
So if we pull all these threads together, the sociological, the psychological, the psychoanalytic, what we see is that this gray revolt isn't irrational at all. It's actually a deeply layered and in its own way rational phenomenon. It's definitely an act of identity maintenance, like we said, restoring self-worth against ageism. It's also very clearly a kind of necessary trauma response, where the specific story they tell about their moral injury shapes whether they seek amends or demand justification. And maybe most importantly, it's a profound signal of systemic failure, where the state's usual methods of control, like deterrence, don't just fail, they actually backfire, strengthening the protesters' resolve and moral certainty.
Yeah, what really stands out for me wrapping this up is just how deeply embedded these current actions, things that look chaotic on the news, are in those unresolved historical conflicts. We're not watching people making up new problems. We're watching a generation grappling, often desperately, to keep a coherent moral sense of self intact when the world feels like it's breaking apart again. The intensity of what they're doing now seems like a direct reflection of the intensity of those old wounds that never fully healed.
And perhaps the biggest takeaway is seeing how the persistence of this particular generational fight really highlights a difficult truth about human conflict itself. That certain kinds of conflicts, especially those rooted in deep moral betrayal, in that shattering of trust, they don't just go away. They aren't ever truly resolved, maybe. They just get repressed for a while, pushed underground, before history's ghosts, you could say, insist on coming back, sometimes decades later, demanding to be played out again in the streets, until maybe, finally, that deep emotional debt gets paid.